Okay, so government and technology. We're going to talk a lot about this. This video, we can talk about kind of the beginning of the end for the Qing. So how their government, failed to transition, and then the Opium Wars, and then finally the Taiping Rebellion. That's probably where we're going to end this video. So during the earlier Tang and Song dynasties, right before the Mongol period, China was a world leader in technology, and we've talked a lot about that in this class. China made a lot of great naval technology, early mechanical works, gunpowder. Uh, you know, right around before the Mongols invaded, China was right on the precipice of the Industrial Revolution of their own. They were starting to work more with iron. They were doing coke manufacturing, which is used in steel production. So China was really close to the Industrial Age. But then, the Mongols invade and everything else happens, blah, 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 blah. Well, during the Ming Qing period, they're becoming incredibly wealthy. And so that's going to also detract from industrialization. They become very wealthy from trade. They were maintaining their traditional way of life, their traditional income. Instead of using the Silk Road, they were now using the Europeans and the ships, and the Europeans were gladly dumping money on them. And so they were becoming incredibly wealthy. China was. Europeans, meanwhile, are building guns and cannons and industrializing, and they're using a lot of technology that China kind of originated. So you think like gunpowder comes out of China, but the guns and cannons of the modern world are being created by Europe now. So China had lost their edge. The technological advancement now is now taking place in Europe. It was not taking place in China anymore, and that is going to be the end of China. That's going to be the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the whole dynastic system. A system that lasted for 2,000 years will end because of the Industrial Revolution. The Qing dynasty especially feared technology. You gotta think, like, Qianlong here, look at his time period. Like, he lived through, he saw the American Revolution, he saw the start of the French Revolution. The Chinese weren't dumb. They looked at what was going on in the rest of the world and they say, hey, you're making all these crazy wackadoodle changes, Europe, and how's that working out for you? You're becoming unstable. Your monarchs are losing their heads in some places, and Napoleon. He died right before Napoleon. But you see these things starting to change in Europe, and change is scary. Once again, just like the Ottomans, if you're number one, why try harder? Why change? You don't want change because change might screw things up. And China was incredibly rich and powerful and didn't want to screw anything up. So why would they want to change, right? They had no incentive to change, at least at first. And then they had a lot of incentives not to change. They were trying to, maintain the stability of their empire. All right, let's end for here. All right. Chinese restrictions on trade. The Qing dynasty was very restrictive on foreigners. Foreigners were not allowed to leave basically certain port cities and also certain regions in those cities. They were basically limited right to the coasts. They were doing this for a few reasons. They were trying to maintain their monopoly on tea and monopolies on porcelain production and silk production, and so they were keeping foreigners out. Just like you might want to maintain your corporate spies, corporate espionage, and maintain your secrets today. This is a similar thing. So China was trying to keep foreigners out and maintain a very limited presence. They wanted the foreigners' money. They wanted Europeans to dump silver into China. They just didn't want any foreigners in China. And they didn't want their foreign religions and their barbarian beliefs, because they looked at anything from Europe as barbarian stuff, like, Christianity is barbarism and that sort of stuff. They didn't want any of these foreign beliefs, foreign ideas in the side of their own country, so they banned it all pretty much. Except for silver. Foreign merchants were stuck basically in these warehouses, essentially called kohangs. The only currency was silver. China would not trade anything other than for silver. So the Europeans would come and say, well, we have trade goods, we have clothing and things like that we could sell you. And the Chinese would say, no, the only thing we'll accept is silver. So they had a pretty good thing going. Meanwhile, while this is going on, the British East India Company was taking over India. And we've already talked about that before. So the British East India Company takes over India, and when they move into India, especially in the northern regions, they find some of the highest quality opium in the world. Opium is still a problem in the world today. The largest producer of opium in the world is Afghanistan, which is just north of India today. But that region, they take over that region, they're moving into Afghanistan, and the British East India Company starts getting involved in the drug trade. They start getting involved in the opium trade. Here's an East India Company stamp on this box of opium. This is in a museum, obviously. This is opium as a natural plant. It grows in a poppy plant. Bulbs of the poppy seed, these seed pockets, I think is what they are, of the poppy plant. These are full of opium. And what happens is the people would go by and they would strike it basically with a razor blade. You would cut two little lines, let the opium sap ooze out. Then they would come back later and scrape it all up and then form it into giant balls. These balls would then be put into the boxes, and the opium East India Company would sell the opium. They would bring it out to Europe. They would sell it in England. They would sell it in the United States of America, and then eventually also going to sell it in China. So the East India Company, the British Empire, let's look at it. The English East India Company gets really involved in the drug business. Opium, of course, is a highly addictive drug. It makes you not feel pain, which is why we still use it for legal means, but it's also used illegally for a lot of reasons. Keep in mind, it was not illegal at first. Opium was sold over the counter in the United States of America. It was sold over the counter in England. It was sometimes mixed with other things. So if you ever read Sherlock Holmes novels, which is set during this time period, Sherlock Holmes was an opium addict. He was addicted to laudanum, which is opium mixed with alcohol. So it became a big deal, and it was kind of all around the world, and the British East India Company was profiting. We think of the British East India Company as like tea and stuff like that, but actually drugs were one of their biggest money makers in the 19th century. So opium is grown in India and then sold in China. And the British East India Company says, hey, we've got this thing. It's highly addictive. It's a drug, and you want it, and we've got it, and we will only sell it to you for silver. And that's when the British finally found a way to break China. Remember, China was incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful. They controlled a huge amount of the world's wealth, and money was being dumped into China. But now drugs are going to be what finally is going to break China, because they figured out a way to make silver leave China. For the last couple hundreds of years, silver went only into China and never came out. Now silver will leave, and it will go into the hands of the British East India Company. So conquering India was kind of an important part of conquering China, or at least breaking China. So let's talk about the opium trade. Opium is a terrible drug. By about 1830, 30 years after Qianlong had passed away, by 1830, opium problems were rampant and obvious throughout the country. It is an addictive drug that wastes you away. Your body will physically waste away. You lose your appetite, and you basically are dying. It kills you. It is a terrible, horrible drug. Today, modern day heroin and Oxycontin and those sort of things, these are opiate-based drugs. These are a similar issue. We're still kind of wrapped up with this drug as a problem. So it's an addictive drug that wastes you away and it slowly kills you. And for the first time ever, silver is flooding out of China as more and more people in China are addicted to this high quality drug. Opium use, by the way, opium had been in use in China in traditional medicine for probably thousands of years. But the Indian opium was super high quality and super addictive. So China, the Chinese emperor, I don't remember his name at this time period, but the Chinese emperor tries to make an attempt to end the opium problem in China, and I hate to say it, but he kind of does. I guess he does kind of end it. How does he do it? Well, he puts a special Confucian scholar. He gives him basically carte blanche. He gives him total control over the country and says, do whatever you have to do to end the opium problem in this country. So Lin Zexu, he gets total control over the economy in the country of China and the government, our military of China, to stamp out the opium problem. So how does he do it? Well, he kills all users of the drug. If you are somebody who is obviously an addict of the drug, if you're caught using the drug or you even show the signs that you are using the drug, your body's wasting away, he would kill you. If you were a government official, so you were part of the Qing dynasty, you worked for the military, you worked for the government, and you were caught involved in the opium business, you were publicly beheaded as a way to discourage anybody else from using the drug, and especially people in the military and government. Then he also destroyed all the opium. He says, well, we have this problem of opium and being, the opium's flooding into the country. Well, where is it coming from? Well, it's coming from the British East India Company and their warehouses on our docks, on our land, in our warehouses on our property. So he goes into these warehouses, he takes all the opium, he makes a giant pit, and he covers it with, I believe, lye, which is a very base chemical, destroys it all, and I believe it's also set on fire afterwards. So the opium is completely obliterated and destroyed, and we're talking about probably millions and millions, if not billions of dollars worth of opium is destroyed. Now, this is where we have difference of opinions. So the Chinese look at it as they're stopping their drug problem. And think about this. In the United States of America, if we saw a giant truck of cocaine coming in across the border from Mexico, our DEA or border agents would take it and destroy it, and that would be totally justified because they're taking a dangerous drug off the market. That's the exact same way the Chinese government viewed it. All right, they had a serious drug problem. They're trying to take serious actions. But that's not how the British are going to view it. The British say, hey, you got to pay us for that. You have to pay us for that opium. Opium sales, that's a legal business. That's something we're involved in. And you have taken our property and destroyed it. You have to pay it for it. Imagine if like Colombia or Bolivia started charging the United States of America for the cocaine that we destroy that crosses our border. That's essentially the same thing that's happening with the opium trade right now. So the British are upset because the Chinese say, hey, we're not going to pay you back for that opium. We're just not going to do it because it's a dangerous drug that's killing our people. We're not going to pay you. And then they said also, we can't pay you. We're going broke. China was losing money. Silver had been flooding out of the country now for decades, and they were going broke. And so they didn't have the money to pay it back. And they said, we'll give you trade goods. And the British said, no, we don't want your trade goods anymore. We only want silver. Things have changed. So you have to pay us in hard currency or else. And China said, well, we don't have any other options. We're not paying you. We don't have the money to pay you, and you won't accept trade goods. So what else? Well, that's the Opium Wars. So the Opium Wars start out, and China, which was a traditional power of the world, right, a traditional military power, basically loses to modern industrial European military powers and forces. So the British send their armies, their navies. They can't totally conquer China, but they can definitely destroy China's navies, and they can start conquering the coastal regions, and using their military, their naval force, they can put pressure on China now. And so China easily loses the Opium War. England easily wins, and it's humiliating. This is a humiliation for China. This nation that used to be one of the most powerful, richest, technologically advanced countries for thousands of years, they lose. And now the British are in a position where they can dictate peace. They can go to the Chinese government and say, you want peace? You want us to stop destroying your ships? You want us to stop shooting cannonballs into your cities on the coasts? Fine, you have to sign this agreement. It's a dictated peace. What is the agreement that comes out of it? Well, first of all, opium's legal. Yay! England forces China to buy opium. That's another part of it. So they force the Chinese to continually buy opium. They say that China cannot make opium illegal. And then they also say that Europeans are now allowed to access China. Why do they want this? Well, Europeans, England wants to have missionaries come to China and start converting the Chinese people to Christianity. They also want to have access to the tea plants, which China had a monopoly on. So they're going to start taking tea plants out of China and moving it to India and other places of the world. So they are destroying China at this time period with drugs. Drugs is what got it started and led to the Opium Wars. But then they're going to start destroying China by infiltrating the culture and removing China's traditional monopolies. And this is where England basically is gaining the dominant upper hand. Another part of it, and you may have heard of this before, but Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a tiny little island down here off the southern coast. They say that's ours now. At first, Hong Kong was not that great of an island, but the English are going to set that up as their main hub, and they're going to own that until the late 1990s. So 1990s. I was alive when they turned that back over to China. So Hong Kong, and there's still a lot of issues with Hong Kong today, but Hong Kong will be owned by the British for a couple hundred years, or about 200 years after the Opium Wars. And yeah, the Opium Wars were basically England force-feeding China opium. It's a drug war. That's what it is, and unfortunately the drug dealers won. All right, so the Opium Wars directly lead to the Taiping Rebellion, and that's how we're going to finish this video here, the Taiping Rebellion. So the Taiping Rebellion, basically right after the Opium Wars, is led by this guy named Hong Shishuan, and you're going to think I'm making this up because his story is a little ridiculous, but this is how it happened. So, Opium War led to missionaries and more foreign involvement in China. And so now there's foreigners coming through China, and there's people talking about Jesus and Christianity and stuff, and that in itself is not bad. But Hong Shishuan learns about Christianity, all right? Now here's his story. He was a Confucian tutor. He had passed the first level of the Confucian exams. Remember, they had different levels of Confucian exams. He had passed the first level, but then failed the next level 3 times. And so his job, basically his role in society, was to be a tutor trying to teach kids how to pass that first level of the exam. So he would go to rich people's houses and try to teach people how to pass their Confucian exams. He was a tutor, a teacher. Okay, but after the 3rd time he fails his exam, he's frustrated and he's angry. And he had recently met with some missionaries, some Christian missionaries. And you got to understand, this is a guy who had never really, this is right after the Opium Wars. This is a guy who had never really had any real experience with Christianity or Western faiths and religions. And then he meets some people who are like, hey, have you ever heard about Jesus? And they give him a real quick rundown of Christianity. And so Hong Shushuan learns briefly, very little, but briefly stuff about Christianity. That night, according to Hong Shushuan, of course, according to legend, that night Hong Shushuan goes to sleep and he has a dream. And in this dream, he is standing next to God and Jesus. And it's, how you understand things in dreams. He understands that he is the younger brother of Jesus. That Jesus had a younger brother, so there was another Jesus essentially, and that this one is Chinese. So Hong Shushuan believes that he is the second coming of Jesus essentially, but he's not Jesus himself. He's the younger brother. Yeah, you can't make that stuff up. I can't. Well, I mean, he probably did. We'll say that. I don't think he was the younger brother of Jesus, but anyways, he believes he was the younger brother of Jesus, and he starts to get people to follow him and his version of Christianity, which had very little to nothing to do with Jesus or Christianity, because you got to remember, this is a guy who had just like basically heard about Christianity recently and then was interpreting what he sort of understood to other people. So anyways, he starts gaining followers, and he starts to become very successful, as a lot of people were frustrated with the Qing dynasty and frustrated with the opium wars and the failures of the government, and maybe the Confucian system was failing, and maybe the Qing dynasty was failing, and here's this guy who seems to have the answers, right? He's a guy who's telling people he has the answers. So he rises up, he tells people that he is the next coming of Jesus, and he rejects the Qing, and he rejects Confucianism. He kills all the Confucian scholars he can get his hands on. Peasants were forced to shave off their queue and swear loyalty to him. If you refused to do these things, you would be killed. And he starts rising up and taking over different parts of China. Preaches the ideas of Jesus, did not practice them at all. He had a harem of women and all sorts of weird stuff. Interesting guy. If you want to dive deep into the Taiping Rebellion, it was a weird time in history. He did ban foot binding, so I guess that's something. All right, Taiping defeat. So Nanjing, the southern capital of China, was captured in 1858 and made into the capital of the Taiping, essentially of Hong Shushuan's weird pseudo-Christian uprising in China. He starts to lead an attack on Beijing with a force of about 1 million people, but eventually be turned back. How was he turned back? Well, largely local Confucian scholars, not necessarily the imperial control, but Confucian scholars using European technology and weaponry, basically outfitting themselves, were able to repel the Taiping Rebellion and start pushing them back. And so the Taiping Rebellion will eventually be defeated, but largely by independent Confucian scholars who were adopting European weaponry, at least at this time period, and realizing the success of European weapons, and starting to adopt these things. And they will manage to put down the Taiping Rebellion. Hong Shushuan himself commits suicide in 1864. By the way, if you notice, I don't know if you know much about U.S. history, but this is right around the same time as the U.S. Civil War. So China's got their own civil war going on right around the same time the United States of America is. Nanjing will eventually be recaptured. Nearly 20 million people died altogether, mostly all of them peasants, and this is one of, if not the bloodiest civil wars in all of world history. So China, I believe it was the Yellow Turban Uprising, is the bloodiest civil war by percentage of population died. The Taiping, I believe, is by body count, the bloodiest civil war in history. So pretty horrendous. I mean, 20 million, that's like, World War II levels for certain nations. Like, that's like what Russia lost in World War II, and this is just China in the Taiping Rebellion. Pretty remarkable numbers. So this guy who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus led to some horrible disasters in China. And obviously China is weaker. China is falling apart. The drug problem, the collapse of their trade control and their monopolies, their government's obviously failing, and then they have one of the bloodiest civil wars in world history. So China is into a weak place. And that's where we'll stop this video.